Chapter 1. Cedric himself knew nothing whatever about it. It had never been even mentioned to him. He knew that his papa had been an Englishman, because his mama had told him so, but then his papa had died when he was so little a boy that he could not remember very much about him, except that he was big, and had blue eyes and a long mustache. When his father was ill, Cedric had been sent away, and when he had returned, everything was over, and his mother was pale and thin, and all the dimples had gone from her pretty face, and her eyes looked large and mournful, and she was dressed in black. "Dearest," said Cedric, his papa had called her that always, and so the little boy had learned to say it, "Dearest, is my papa better?" Then suddenly his loving little heart told him that he'd better put both his arms around her neck and kiss her again and again, and keep his soft cheek close to hers. Later he was told that his mama was an orphan, and quite alone in the world when his papa had married her. She was very pretty, and had been living as companion to a rich old lady who was not kind to her, and one day Captain Cedric Carroll, who was calling at the house, saw her run up the stairs with tears on her eyelashes, and she looked so sweet and innocent and sorrowful that the captain could not forget her. And after many strange things had happened, they knew each other well and loved each other dearly, and were married, although their marriage brought them the ill will of several people. The one who was the angriest of all, however, was the captain's father, who lived in England, and was a very rich and important old nobleman, with a very bad temper and a very violent dislike to America and Americans. He had 2 sons older than Captain Cedric. But it so happened that nature had given to the youngest son gifts which she had not bestowed upon his elder brothers. He was brave and generous, and had the kindest heart in the world, and seemed to have the power to make everyone love him. And it was not so with his elder brothers. Neither of them was handsome, or very kind, or clever. It was very bitter, the old Earl thought, that the son who was only 3rd, and would have only a very small fortune, should be the one who had all the gifts, and all the charms, and all of the strength and beauty. It was in one of his fits of petulance that he sent him off to travel in America. But when the Earl received his son's letter about his marriage, he was furiously angry and ordered him never to come near his old home, nor to write to his father or brothers again. He told him that he should be cut off from his family forever, and that he should never expect help from his father as long as he lived. The captain was very sad when he read the letter. He sold his commission in the English army, and after some trouble found a position in New York, and married. And he was never sorry for a moment that he had married the rich old lady's pretty companion just because she was so sweet and he loved her and she loved him. She was very sweet, indeed, and her little boy was like both her and his father. Instead of being a bald-headed baby, he started in life with a quantity of soft, fine, gold-colored hair, which curled up at the ends, and went into loose rings by the time he was 6 months old. He had big brown eyes and long eyelashes and a darling little face. He had so strong a back and such splendid sturdy legs, that at 9 months he learned suddenly to walk. His manners were so good, for a baby, that it was delightful to make his acquaintance. And every month of his life he grew handsomer and more interesting. As he grew older, he had a great many quaint little ways which amused and interested people greatly. He was so much of a companion for his mother that she scarcely cared for any other. They used to walk together and talk together and play together. Mary, his nurse, was very fond of him, and very proud of him, too. She was proud of his graceful, strong little body and his pretty manners. Cedric had a very close friend, Mr. Hobbs, an owner of a very small shop. Mr. Hobbs was fond of reading the newspapers, and so Cedric heard a great deal about what was going on in Washington. It was not long after this election, when Cedric was between 7 and 8 years old, that the very strange thing happened which made so wonderful a change in his life. It was quite curious, too, that the day it happened he had been talking to Mr. Hobbs about England and the Queen, and Mr. Hobbs had said some very severe things about the aristocracy, being especially indignant against earls and marquises. That afternoon Cedric reached his own house and saw a coupe standing before the door. And someone was in the little parlor talking to his mamma. A tall, thin old gentleman with a sharp face was sitting in an armchair. His mother was standing nearby with a pale face, and he saw that there were tears in her eyes. "Oh, Ceddie!" she cried out. "Oh, Ceddie, darling!" The tall old gentleman rose from his chair and looked at Cedric with his sharp eyes. He rubbed his thin chin with his bony hand as he looked. He seemed not at all displeased. "And so," he said at last, slowly, "and so this is little Lord Fauntleroy." Chapter 2. There was never a more amazed little boy than Cedric during the week that followed. There was never so strange or so unreal a week. In the first place, the story his mamma told him was a very curious one. He was obliged to hear it 2 or 3 times before he could understand it. It began with Earls. His grandpapa, whom he had never seen, was an earl, and his eldest uncle, if he had not been killed by a fall from his horse, would have been an earl, too, in time, and after his death, his other uncle would have been an earl, if he had not died suddenly, in Rome, of a fever. After that, his own papa, if he had lived, would have been an earl, but, since they all had died and only Cedric was left, it appeared that he was to be an earl after his grandpa's death, and for the present he was Lord Fauntleroy. He turned quite pale when he was first told of it. "Oh, dearest," He said, "I should rather not be an earl." "None of the boys are earls." "Can't I not be one?" But it seemed to be unavoidable. And when, that evening, they sat together by the open window looking out into the shabby street, he and his mother had a long talk about it. His grandfather had sent for him to come to England, and his mamma thought he must go. "Because," she said, looking out of the window with sorrowful eyes, "I know your papa would wish it to be so," said he. "He loved his home very much, and there are many things to be thought of that a little boy can't quite understand. I should be a selfish little mother if I did not send you. When you are a man, you will see why." He shook his head mournfully. "I shall be very sorry to leave Mr. Hobbs," he said. "I'm afraid he'll miss me, and I shall miss him. And I shall miss them all." When Mr. Havisham, who was the family lawyer of the Earl of Dorincourt, and who had been sent by him to bring Lord Fauntleroy to England, came the next day, Cedric heard many things. But, somehow, it did not console him to hear that he was to be a very rich man when he grew up, and that he would have castles here and castles there, and great parks and deep mines and grand estates and tenantry. He was troubled about his friend, Mr. Hobbs, and he went to see him at the store soon after breakfast, in great anxiety of mind. "Hello," said Mr. Hobbs. "Morning." "Hello," he said again. Cedric gathered all his strength of mind together and told Mr. Hobbs his news. The latter put his big hand on the little boy's hair. This was more embarrassing than ever. Mr. Hobbs seemed to grow hotter and hotter. When he looked at the little boy sitting on the cracker box, with the innocent, anxious expression in his childish eyes, and saw that he was not changed at all, but was simply as he had been the day before, just a handsome, cheerful, brave little fellow in a blue suit and red neck ribbon, all this information about the nobility bewildered him. "What did you say your name was?" Mr. Hobbs inquired. "It's Cedric Carroll, Lord Fauntleroy," answered Cedric. He looked at Mr. Hobbs wistfully. "England is a long way off, isn't it?" he asked. "It's across the Atlantic Ocean," Mr. Hobbs answered. "That's the worst of it," said Cedric. "The best of friends must part," said Mr. Hobbs. His conversation with Mr. Hobbs was a long and serious one. Chapter 3. That morning Mr. Havisham had quite a long conversation with Cedric. At first Mr. Havisham wondered what he should say to his small companion. But Cedric relieved him by suddenly beginning the conversation himself. "Do you know," he said, "I don't know what an earl is? And I think when a boy is going to be one, he ought to know. Don't you?" "Well, Yes, answered Mr. Havisham. Would you mind, said Seti respectfully, explaining it to me? A king or queen, in the first place, said Mr. Havisham. Generally, he is made an earl because he has done some service to his sovereign, or some great deed. Oh, said Cedric, that's like the president. Mr. Havisham crossed his own legs and put the tips of his fingers carefully together. He thought perhaps the time had come to explain matters rather more clearly. An earl is a very important person, he began. An earl is frequently a very ancient lineage. What's that? Asked Seti. A very old family, extremely old. Ah, said Cedric, thrusting his hands deeper into his pockets. I suppose that is the way with the apple woman near the park. I dare say she is of ancient lineage. She is so old it would surprise you how she can stand up. She's 100, I should think. I'm sorry for her, and so are the other boys. And when we have some money, we try to buy her apples to help her. You feel sorry for anyone that's so poor and has such ancient lineage. She says hers has gone into her bones and the rain makes it worse. Mr. Havisham felt rather at a loss as he looked at his companion's innocent, serious little face. I am afraid you did not quite understand me, he explained. When I said ancient lineage I did not mean old age. I meant that the name of such a family has been known in the world a long time, perhaps for hundreds of years. Persons bearing that name have been known and spoken of in the history of their country. The first Earl of Dorincourt, said Mr. Havisham solemnly, was created an earl 400 years ago. Well, well, said Seti. That was a long time ago. What else does an earl do besides being created? A great many of them have helped to govern England. Some of them have been brave men and have fought in great battles in the old days. I should like to do that myself, said Cedric. My papa was a soldier, and he was a very brave man, as brave as George Washington. There is another advantage in being an earl, sometimes, said Mr. Havisham slowly, and he fixed his shrewd eyes on the little boy with a rather curious expression. Some earls have a great deal of money. That's a good thing to have, said Seti innocently. I wish I had a great deal of money. Do you? Said Mr. Havisham. And why? Well, explained Cedric, there are so many things a person can do with money. You see, there's the apple woman. If I were very rich I should buy her a little tent to put her stall in, and a little stove, and then I should give her $1 every morning it rained, so that she could afford to stay at home. Ahem! Said Mr. Havisham. And what else would you do if you were rich? Oh, I do a great many things. Of course, I should buy dearest all sorts of beautiful things. And then Dick, who is Dick? Asked Mr. Havisham. Dick is a bootblack, said his young lordship, quite warming up in his interest in plans so exciting. He is one of the nicest bootblacks you ever knew. He stands at the corner of a street downtown. I've known him for years. And what would you like to do for him? Inquired the lawyer. Well, said Lord Fauntleroy, settling himself in his chair with a business air, I'd buy Jake out. And who is Jake? Mr. Havisham asked. He's Dick's partner, and he is the worst partner a fellow could have. Dick says so. So if I were rich, I'd buy Jake out and get Dick a boss sign. He says a boss sign goes a long way, and I'd get him some new clothes and new brushes, and start him out fair. He says all he wants is to start out fair. There could have been nothing more confiding and innocent than the way in which his small lordship told his little story, quoting his friend Dick's bits of slang in the most candid good faith. Is there anything Mr. Havisham began? What would you get for yourself, if you were rich? Lots of things, answered Lord Fauntleroy briskly, but first I'd give Mary some money for Bridget, that's her sister, with 12 children, and a husband out of work. And I think Mr. Hobbs would like a gold watch and chain to remember me by, and a meerschaum pipe. The door opened and Mrs. Errol came in. Ibis young gentleman, said Mr. Havisham, has been telling me about some of his friends, and what he would do for them if he were rich. Bridget is one of his friends, said Mrs. Errol, and it is Bridget to whom I have been talking in the kitchen. She is in great trouble now because her husband has rheumatic fever. Cedric ran out of the room, and Mr. Havisham rose from his chair. He seemed to have something in his mind which he wished to speak of. He hesitated a moment, and then said, looking down at Mrs. Errol, before I left Dorincourt Castle, I had an interview with the Earl, in which he gave me some instructions. He is desirous that his grandson should look forward with some pleasure to his future life in England, and also to his acquaintance with himself. And Cedric's mother thought that perhaps this meant that a lonely, unhappy old man, whose children were dead, wished to be kind to her little boy, and win his love and confidence. And it pleased her very much to think that Ceddie would be able to help Bridget. It made her happier to know that the very first result of the strange fortune which had happened to her little boy was that he could do kind things for those who needed kindness. Quite a warm color bloomed on her pretty young face. "Oh," she said, "that was very kind of the Earl. Cedric will be so glad. Bridget will not be wasteful of what is given her." Then his mother went for Cedric and brought him back into the parlor. His little face looked quite anxious when he came in. He was very sorry for Bridget. Mr. Havisham looked down at him a moment. He felt a little awkward and undecided. As Cedric's mother had said, he was a very little boy. "Ceddie," she said, "the Earl is your grandpapa, your own papa's father. He is very, very kind, and he loves you and wishes you to love him, because the sons who were his little boys are dead. He wishes you to be happy and to make other people happy. He is very rich, and he wishes you to have everything you would like to have." Mr. Havisham handed him the money. Ceddie flew out of the room with it. He was happy to help Bridget and her family. His mother followed him as she thought she should explain Bridget everything properly. Cedric and his mother came back soon after. "It's more agreeable to be an earl than I thought it was. I'm almost quite glad I'm going to be one." Chapter 4. Cedric's good opinion of the advantages of being an earl increased greatly during the next week. It seemed almost impossible for him to realize that there was scarcely anything he might wish to do which he could not do easily. In fact, I think it may be said that he did not fully realize it at all. But at least he understood, after a few conversations with Mr. Havisham, that he could satisfy all his nearest wishes, and he proceeded to satisfy them with a simplicity and delight which caused Mr. Havisham much diversion. In the week before they sailed for England he did many curious things. The lawyer long after remembered the morning they went downtown together to pay a visit to Dick, and the afternoon they so amazed the apple woman of ancient lineage by stopping before her stall and telling her she was to have a tent, and a stove, and a shawl, and a sum of money which seemed to her quite wonderful. "For I have to go to England and be a lord," explained Cedric, sweet-temperedly. "And I shouldn't like to have your bones on my mind every time it rained. My own bones never hurt, so I think I don't know how painful a person's bones can be, but I've sympathized with you a great deal, and I hope you'll be better." The interview with Dick was quite exciting. Dick had just been having a great deal of trouble with Jake, and was in low spirits when they saw him. His amazement when Cedric calmly announced that they had come to give him what seemed a very great thing to him, and would set all his troubles right, almost struck him dumb. Lord Fauntleroy's manner of announcing the object of his visit was very simple and unceremonious. Mr. Havisham was much impressed by its directness as he stood by and listened. The statement that his old friend had become a lord, and was in danger of being an earl if he lived long enough, caused Dick to so open his eyes and mouth that his cap fell off. And the end of the matter was that Dick actually bought Jake out, and found himself the possessor of the business and some new brushes and a most astonishing sign and outfit. "Well, goodbye," he said, and though he tried to speak steadily, there was a little tremble in his voice and he winked his big brown eyes. "And I hope trade will be good. I'm sorry I'm going away to leave you, but perhaps I shall come back again when I'm an earl. And I wish you'd write to me. And my name isn't Cedric Earl anymore, it's Lord Fauntleroy and goodbye, Dick." Dick winked his eyes, and yet they looked rather moist about the lashes. He was not an educated bootblack, and he would have found it difficult to tell what he felt. And when they turned away he stood and looked after them in amazement, and there was still a mist in his eyes, and a lump in his throat. Until the day of his departure, his lordship spent as much time as possible with Mr. Hobbs in the store. Gloom had settled upon Mr. Hobbs, he was much depressed in spirits. When his young friend brought to him in triumph the parting gift of a gold watch and chain, Mr. Hobbs found it difficult to acknowledge it properly. He laid the case on his stout knee, and blew his nose violently several times. "There's something written on it," said Cedric, "inside the case. I told the man myself what to say. From his oldest friend, Lord Fauntleroy, to Mr. Hobbs. When this you see, remember me. I don't want you to forget me." Mr. Hobbs blew his nose very loudly again. "I shouldn't forget you," he said, speaking a trifle huskily, as Dick had spoken, "nor don't you go and forget me when you get among the British aristocracy." At last all the preparations were complete, the day came when the trunks were taken to the steamer, and the hour arrived when the carriage stood at the door. Then a curious feeling of loneliness came upon the little boy. He knew something made both his mother and him sorry, though he scarcely knew what it was, but one tender little thought rose to his lips. "We liked this little house, dearest, didn't we?" he said. "We always will like it, won't we?" "Yes, yes," she answered, in a low, sweet voice. "Yes, darling." And then they went into the carriage, and as she looked back out of the window, he looked at her and stroked her hand and held it close. And then, it seemed almost directly, they were on the steamer in the midst of the wildest bustle and confusion. Cedric found something to interest him on every side. He began to make plans for conversing with the sailors and gaining some information on the subject of pirates. It was just at the very last that his attention was called to a slight bustle in one of the groups not far from him. Someone was hurriedly forcing his way through this group and coming toward him. It was a boy, with something red in his hand. It was Dick. He came up to Cedric quite breathless. "I've run all the way," he said. "I've come down to see you off. Trade has been prime. I bought this for you out of what I made yesterday. You can wear it when you get among the swells." It's a handkerchief. He poured it all forth as if in one sentence. A bell rang, and he made a leap away before Cedric had time to speak. "Goodbye," he panted. "Wear it when you get among the swells." And he darted off and was gone. He stood on the wharf and waved his cap. Cedric held the handkerchief in his hand. It was a bright red silk ornamented with purple horseshoes and horses' heads. "Goodbye. Goodbye, old fellow." Everyone seemed to be saying, "Don't forget us. Right when you get to Liverpool. Goodbye. Goodbye." Little Lord Fauntleroy leaned forward and waved the red handkerchief. "Goodbye, Dick," he shouted, lustily. "Thank you. Goodbye, Dick." And the big steamer moved away. Chapter 5. It was during the voyage that Cedric's mother told him that his home was not to be hers, and when he first understood it, his grief was so great that Mr. Havisham told him the Earl had been wise in making the arrangements that his mother should be quite near him, and see him often. "My house is not far from the castle," said he. She repeated each time the subject was referred to, "and you can always run in and see me every day. It is a beautiful place. Your papa has often told me about it. He loved it very much, and you will love it too." "I should love it better if you were there," his small lordship said. He could not but feel puzzled by so strange a state of affairs, which could put his dearest in one house and himself in another. The fact was that Mr. S. Errol had thought it better not to tell him why this plan had been made. "He would not really understand," she said to Mr. Havisham. "He would only be shocked and hurt, and his feeling for the Earl will be a more natural and affectionate one if he does not know that his grandfather dislikes me so bitterly. He is so loving himself, and I am so dear to him. It would make a barrier between them, even though Ceddy is such a child." So Cedric only knew that there was some mysterious reason for the arrangement, some reason which he was not old enough to understand, but which would be explained when he was older. One of the things which always delighted the people who made the acquaintance of his young lordship was the sage little air he wore at times when he gave himself up to conversation, combined with his occasionally elderly remarks and the extreme innocence and seriousness of his round childish face. It was irresistible. Gradually Mr. Havisham had begun to derive a great deal of private pleasure and amusement from his society. It was 11 days after he had said goodbye to his friend Dick before he reached Liverpool, and it was on the night of the 12th day that the carriage in which he and his mother and Mr. Havisham had driven from the station stopped before the gates of Court Lodge. They could not see much of the house in the darkness, and after the carriage had rolled down this driveway a short distance, he saw an open door and a stream of bright light coming through it. Mary had come with them to attend her mistress, and she had reached the house before them. When Cedric jumped out of the carriage, he saw one or two servants standing in the wide, bright hall, and Mary stood in the doorway. Lord Fauntleroy sprang at her with a gay little shout. "Did you get here, Mary?" he said. "Here's Mary, dearest," and he kissed the maid on her rough red cheek. "I am glad you are here, Mary," Mrs. Errol said to her in a low voice. "It is such a comfort to me to see you. It takes the strangeness away." The English servants looked with curiosity at both the boy and his mother. They had heard all sorts of rumors about them both. They knew how angry the old Earl had been, and why Mrs. Errol wished to live at the lodge and her little boy at the castle. Cedric pulled off his overcoat and began to look about. He looked about the broad hall, at the pictures and stag's antlers and curious things that ornamented it. They seemed curious to him because he had never seen such things before in a private house. Mrs. Errol looked at the lawyer. "Will you tell him, if you please," she said, "that I should rather not have the money? I think I should rather not have it. I am obliged to accept the house, and I thank him for it, but I have a little money of my own, and I should rather not take the other. As he dislikes me so much, I should feel a little as if I were selling Cedric to him." Mr. Havisham rubbed his chin. "This is very strange," he said. "He will be very angry. He won't understand it. But why should I accept luxuries from the man who hates me so much that he takes my little boy from me, his son's child?" When, later in the evening, Mr. Havisham presented himself at the castle, he was taken at once to the Earl. "Well," he said, "well, Havisham, come back, have you? What's the news?" "Lord Fauntleroy and his mother are at Court Lodge," replied Mr. Havisham. "They bore the voyage very well and are in excellent health." The Earl made a half-impatient sound and moved his hand restlessly. "Well," he said, "what sort of a lad is he?" "It is rather difficult to judge of the character of a child of 7, he said cautiously. The Earl's prejudices were very intense. He looked up quickly and uttered a rough word. "A fool, is he?" he exclaimed. "His American blood tells, does it? I don't know much about children, but I thought him rather a fine lad." "Healthy and well grown?" asked my lord. "Apparently very healthy, and quite well grown," replied the lawyer. "Straight-limbed and well enough to look at?" demanded the Earl. "Rather a handsome boy, I think, my lord, as boys go," he said. "But you will find him somewhat different from most English children, I dare say. I haven't a doubt of that, snarled the Earl, a twinge of gout seizing him. A lot of impudent little beggars, those American children, I've heard that often enough. It is not exactly impudence in his case, said Mr. Havisham. American impudence, protested the Earl. I've heard of it before. They call it precocity and freedom. Beastly, impudent bad manners, that's what it is. There was a silence of a few moments. It was Mr. Havisham who broke it. I have a message to deliver from Mrs. Errol, he remarked. I don't want any of her messages, growled his lordship. This is a rather important one, explained the lawyer. She prefers not to accept the income you propose to settle on her. She says it is not necessary, and that as the relations between you are not friendly, ejaculated my lord savagely, I should say they were not friendly. I hate to think of her. A mercenary, sharp-voiced American. I don't wish to see her. My lord, said Mr. Havisham, you can scarcely call her mercenary. She has asked for nothing. She does not accept the money you offer her. All done for effect, snapped his noble lordship. She shall have the money, whether she likes it or not. She also asks you not to let Lord Fauntleroy hear anything which would lead him to understand that you separate him from her because of your prejudice against her. He is very fond of her, and she is convinced that it would cause a barrier to exist between you. She has told him that he is too young to understand the reason, but shall hear it when he is older. She wishes that there should be no shadow on your first meeting. Come, now, he said, still breathlessly. Come, now. You don't mean the mother hasn't told him? Not one word, my lord, replied the lawyer coolly. Chapter 6. It was late in the afternoon when the carriage containing little Lord Fauntleroy and Mr. Havisham drove up the long avenue which led to the castle. Cedric greeted the Earl cheerfully and confidently. The Earl was taken aback. Children were usually afraid of him. When Cedric told him about the people he had helped in New York, the Earl started to soften. Soon the dinner was announced. Cedric left his chair and went to his noble kinsman. He looked down at his gouty foot. Would you like me to help you? He said politely. You could lean on me, you know. Once when Mr. Hobbs hurt his foot he used to lean on me. The big footman almost perilled his reputation and his situation by smiling. But he had a very narrow escape. He only just saved himself by staring straight over the Earl's head at a very ugly picture. The Earl looked his valiant young relative over from head to foot. "Do you think you could do it?" he asked gruffly. "I think I could," said Cedric. "I'm strong. I'm 7, you know." "Well," said the Earl, "you may try." Cedric gave him his stick and began to assist him to rise. The Earl chose to try an experiment. He got up slowly and put his hand on the small shoulder presented to him with so much courage. Little Lord Fauntleroy made a careful step forward, looking down at the gouty foot. If the Earl had been supported by the footman, he would have rested less on his stick and more on his assistant's arm. And yet it was part of his experiment to let his grandson feel his burden as no light weight. It was quite a heavy weight indeed, and after a few steps his young lordship's face grew quite hot, and his heart beat rather fast, but he braced himself sturdily. "Don't be afraid of leaning on me," he panted. "I'm all right, if it isn't a very long way." It was not really very far to the dining room, but it seemed rather a long way to Cedric, before they reached the chair at the head of the table. The hand on his shoulder seemed to grow heavier at every step, and his face grew redder and hotter, and his breath shorter, but he never thought of giving up. He stiffened his childish muscles, held his head erect, and encouraged the Earl as he limped along. But they reached the chair, at last. The hand was removed from his shoulder, and the Earl was fairly seated. Cedric took out Dick's handkerchief and wiped his forehead. "You have been doing some rather hard work," said the Earl. "Oh, no," said Lord Fauntleroy, "it wasn't exactly hard, but I got a little warm. A person will get warm in summer time." And he rubbed his damp curls rather vigorously with the gorgeous handkerchief. His own chair was placed at the other end of the table, opposite his grandfather's. Everything he had seen so far, the great rooms, with their high ceilings, the massive furniture, the big footman, the big dog, the Earl himself, were all of proportions calculated to make this little lad feel that he was very small, indeed. But that did not trouble him. He had never thought himself very large or important. Dinner was usually a very serious matter with the Earl, and it was a very serious matter with the cook, if his lordship was not pleased or had an indifferent appetite. Today, however, his appetite seemed a trifle better than usual, perhaps because he had something to think of. His grandson gave him something to think of. He kept looking at him across the table. He did not say very much himself, but he managed to make the boy talk. He had never imagined that he could be entertained by hearing a child talk, but Lord Fauntleroy at once puzzled and amused him, and he kept remembering how he had let the childish shoulder feel his weight just for the sake of trying how far the boy's courage and endurance would go, and it pleased him to know that his grandson had not quailed and had not seemed to think even for a moment of giving up what he had undertaken to do. "You don't wear your coronet all the time?" remarked Lord Fauntleroy respectfully. "No," replied the Earl, with his grim smile, "it is not becoming to me." "Mr. Hobbs said you always wore it," said Cedric, "but after he thought it over, he said he supposed you must sometimes take it off to put your hat on." "Yes," said the Earl, "I take it off occasionally." And one of the footmen suddenly turned aside and gave a singular little cough behind his hand. Cedric finished his dinner first, and then he leaned back in his chair and took a survey of the room. "You must be very proud of your house," he said, "it's such a beautiful house. I never saw anything so beautiful, but, of course, as I'm only 7, I haven't seen much." "And you think I must be proud of it, do you?" said the Earl. Then he paused an instant and looked across the table rather wistfully. "It's a very big house for just 2 people to live in, isn't it?" he said. "It is quite large enough for 2, answered the Earl. "Do you find it too large?" His little lordship hesitated a moment. "I was only thinking," he said, "that if 2 people lived in it who were not very good companions, they might feel lonely sometimes." "Do you think I shall make a good companion?" inquired the Earl. "Yes," replied Cedric, "I think you will. Mr. Hobbs and I were great friends. He was the best friend I had except Dearest." The Earl made a quick movement of his bushy eyebrows. "Who is Dearest?" "She is my mother," said Lord Fauntleroy, in a rather low, quiet little voice. Perhaps he was a trifle tired, as his bedtime was nearing, and perhaps after the excitement of the last few days it was natural he should be tired, so perhaps, too, the feeling of weariness brought to him a vague sense of loneliness in the remembrance that tonight he was not to sleep at home, watched over by the loving eyes of that best friend of his. They had always been best friends, this boy and his young mother. He could not help thinking of her, and the more he thought of her the less was he inclined to talk, and by the time the dinner was at an end the Earl saw that there was a faint shadow on his face. But Cedric bore himself with excellent courage. When the footman left them alone, Cedric sat down upon the hearthrug near Dougal. For a few minutes he stroked the dog's ears in silence and looked at the fire. The Earl watched him. The boy's eyes looked wistful and thoughtful, and once or twice he gave a little sigh. The Earl sat still, and kept his eyes fixed on his grandson. "Fauntleroy," he said at last, "what are you thinking of?" Fauntleroy looked up with a manful effort at a smile. "I was thinking about Dearest," he said, and I think I'd better get up and walk up and down the room." He rose up, and put his hands in his small pockets, and began to walk to and fro. It disturbed the Earl to see the struggle the little fellow was having with his first feeling of homesickness, but it pleased him to see that he was making so brave an effort to bear it well. He liked this childish courage. "Come here," he said. Fauntleroy went to him. "I never was away from my own house before," said the boy, with a troubled look in his brown eyes. It makes a person feel a strange feeling when he has to stay all night in another person's castle instead of in his own house. But Dearest is not very far away from me. She told me to remember that, and I'm 7, and I can look at the picture she gave me." He put his hand in his pocket, and brought out a small violet velvet covered case. "This is it," he said. "You see, you press this spring and it opens, and she is in there." He had come close to the Earl's chair, and, as he drew forth the little case, he leaned against the arm of it, and against the old man's arm, too, as confidingly as if children had always leaned there. "There she is," he said, as the case opened, and he looked up with a smile. The Earl knitted his brows. He did not wish to see the picture, but he looked at it in spite of himself, and there looked up at him from it such a pretty young face, a face so like the child's at his side, that it quite startled him. "I suppose you think you are very fond of her," he said. "Yes," answered Lord Fauntleroy, in a gentle tone. There was a long silence. In about half an hour's time Mr. Havisham was ushered in. The great room was very still when he entered. The Earl was still leaning back in his chair. He moved as Mr. Havisham approached, and held up his hand in a gesture of warning. It seemed as if he had scarcely intended to make the gesture, as if it were almost involuntary. Dougal was still asleep, and close beside the great dog, sleeping also, with his curly head upon his arm, lay little Lord Fauntleroy. Chapter 7. When Lord Fauntleroy wakened in the morning, he had not wakened at all when he had been carried to bed the night before. The first sounds he was conscious of were the crackling of a wood fire and the murmur of voices. "You will be careful, Dawson, not to say anything about it," he heard someone say. "He does not know why she is not to be with him, and the reason is to be kept from him." "If these are his lordship's orders, ma'am," another voice answered, "they'll have to be kept, I suppose." "But, everyone in this castle, servant or not servant, are talking about that poor, pretty, young widowed creature from her own flesh and blood, and him such a little beauty and a nobleman born. They say as they never see anything in their lives like that little fellow's ways, as innocent and polite and interested as if he'd been sitting there dining with his best friend, and the temper of an angel." Cedric moved on his pillow, and turned over, opening his eyes. There were two women in the room. Everything was bright and cheerful with gay flowered chintz. There was a fire on the hearth, and the sunshine was streaming in through the ivy-entwined windows. Both women came toward him, and he saw that one of them was Mrs. Mellon, the housekeeper, and the other a comfortable, middle-aged woman, with a face as kind and good-humored as a face could be. "Good morning, my lord," said Mrs. Mellon. "Did you sleep well?" His lordship rubbed his eyes and smiled. "Good morning," he said. "I didn't know I was here." "You were carried upstairs when you were asleep," said the housekeeper. "This is your bedroom, and this is Dawson, who is to take care of you." Fauntleroy sat up in bed and held out his hand to Dawson, as he had held it out to the Earl. "How do you do, madam?" he said. "I'm much obliged to you for coming to take care of me." "You can call her Dawson, my lord," said the housekeeper with a smile. "She is used to being called Dawson." "Will you get up now, and let Dawson dress you, and then have your breakfast in the nursery?" "I learned to dress myself many years ago, thank you," answered Fauntleroy. "Dearest taught me. I can take my bath, too, pretty well if you'll just be kind enough to examine the corners after I'm done." Dawson and the housekeeper exchanged glances. "Dawson will do anything you ask her to," said Mrs. Mellon. "That I will, bless him," said Dawson, in her comforting, good-humored voice. "He shall dress himself if he likes, and I'll stand by, ready to help him if he wants me." "Thank you," responded Lord Fauntleroy. "It's a little hard sometimes about the buttons, you know, and then I have to ask somebody." He thought Dawson a very kind woman, and before the bath and the dressing were finished they were excellent friends, and he had found out a great deal about her. He had discovered that her husband had been a soldier and had been killed in a real battle, and that her son was a sailor, and was away on a long cruise, and that he had seen pirates and cannibals and Chinese people and Turks, and that he brought home strange shells and pieces of coral which Dawson was ready to show at any moment, some of them being in her trunk. All this was very interesting. When he went into the adjoining room to take his breakfast, and saw what a great room it was, and found there was another adjoining it which Dawson told him was his also, the feeling that he was very small indeed came over him again so strongly that he confided it to Dawson, as he sat down to the table on which the pretty breakfast service was arranged. "I am a very little boy," he said rather wistfully, "to live in such a large castle, and have so many big rooms, don't you think so?" "Oh! Come!" said Dawson, "you feel just a little strange at first, that's all, but you'll get over that very soon, and then you'll like it here. It's such a beautiful place, you know." "It's a very beautiful place, of course," said Fauntleroy, with a little sigh, but I should like it better if I didn't miss dearest so. I always had my breakfast with her in the morning. Oh, well, answered Dawson, comfortingly, you know you can see her every day. Bless you. Wait till you've walked about a bit and seen things, the dogs, and the stables with all the horses in them. There's one of them I know you'll like to see. At this he naturally began to grow curious, and he applied himself assiduously to his breakfast. It seemed to him that there must be something worth looking at, in the next room. Dawson had such a consequential, mysterious air. Now, then, he said, slipping off his seat a few minutes later, I've had enough. Can I go and look at it? Dawson nodded and led the way, looking more mysterious and important than ever. He began to be very much interested indeed. When she opened the door of the room, he stood upon the threshold and looked about him in amazement. He did not speak, he only put his hands in his pockets and stood there flushing up to his forehead and looking in. He flushed up because he was so surprised and, for the moment, excited. To see such a place was enough to surprise any ordinary boy. The room was a large one, too. There were shelves full of books, and on the tables were numbers of toys, beautiful, ingenious things, such as he had looked at with wonder and delight through the shop windows in New York. It looks like a boy's room, he said at last, catching his breath a little. Whom do they belong to? Go and look at them, said Dawson. They belong to you. To me. He cried, to me? Why do they belong to me? Who gave them to me? And he sprang forward with a gay little shout. It seemed almost too much to be believed. It was Grandpapa. He said, with his eyes as bright as stars. I know it was Grandpapa. It was a tremendously exciting morning. Did you ever know anyone, he said to Dawson, who had such a kind grandfather? Dawson's face wore an uncertain expression for a moment. She had not a very high opinion of his lordship the Earl. She had not been in the house many days, but she had been there long enough to hear the old nobleman's peculiarities discussed very freely in the servants' hall. And of all the vicious, savage, ill-tempered old fellows it was ever my ill luck to wear livery-hander, the tallest footman had said, he's the most violent I have ever met. Chapter 8. The Earl had passed a bad night and had spent the morning in his room, but at noon, after he had lunched, he sent for his grandson. Fauntleroy answered the summons at once. He came down the broad staircase with a bounding step. I was waiting for you to send for me, he said. I was ready a long time ago. I'm ever so much obliged to you for all those things. I'm ever so much obliged to you. I have been playing with them all the morning." "Oh," said the Earl, "you like them, do you?" "I like them so much, well, I couldn't tell you how much," said Fauntleroy, his face glowing with delight. "There's one that's like baseball, only you play it on a board with black and white pegs, and you keep your score with some counters on a wire. I tried to teach Dawson, but she couldn't quite understand it just at first. You see, she never played baseball, being a lady, and I'm afraid I wasn't very good at explaining it to her. But you know all about it, don't you?" "Go and get it," said the Earl. It certainly was a novel entertainment this, making a companion of a child who offered to teach him to play games, but the very novelty of it amused him. There was a smile lurking about the Earl's mouth when Cedric came back with a box containing the game, in his arms, and an expression of the most eager interest on his face. But the game was soon interrupted and Thomas announced a visitor. The visitor in question, who was an elderly gentleman in black, and no less a person than the clergyman of the parish. The Earl glanced around, knitting his shaggy eyebrows as he had a trick of doing, and when he saw who it was, Mr. Mordaunt was still more surprised to see that he looked even less disagreeable than usual. "Ah!" the Earl said, in his harsh voice, but giving his hand rather graciously. "Good morning, Mordaunt. I've found a new employment, you see." "This is the new Lord Fauntleroy," he said. "Fauntleroy, this is Mr. Mordaunt, the rector of the parish." After exchanging a few polite phrases and a second of doubt, Mr. Mordaunt turned to business. "It is Higgins," he said, "Higgins of Vetch Farm. He has been very unfortunate. He was ill himself last autumn, and his children had scarlet fever. I can't say that he is a very good manager, but he has had ill luck, and of course he is behindhand in many ways. He is in trouble about his rent now. Newick tells him if he doesn't pay it, he must leave the place, and of course that would be a very serious matter. His wife is ill, and he came to me yesterday to beg me to see about it, and ask you for time. He thinks if you would give him time he could catch up again." "They all think that," said the Earl, looking rather black. Fauntleroy made a movement forward. He had been standing between his grandfather and the visitor, listening with all his might. He had begun to be interested in Higgins at once. "I forgot you," said the Earl. "I forgot we had a philanthropist in the room." He bent his gaze on the boy for a few seconds in silence. The fact was that a new thought was coming to him, and though, perhaps, it was not prompted by the noblest emotions, it was not a bad thought. "Come here," he said, at last. "What would you do in this case?" his lordship asked. After a short discussion, it was decided that Cedric would write to Newick a letter in which, on behalf of Lord Fauntleroy, convincingly asked to leave Higgins alone. There was a huge amount of mistakes in the letter. "I was afraid of that," said Fauntleroy. "I ought to have asked." You see, that's the way with words of more than one syllable, you have to look in the dictionary. It's always safest. I'll write it over again. And write it over again he did, making quite an imposing copy, and taking precautions in the matter of spelling by consulting the Earl himself. When Mr. Mordaunt went away, he took the letter with him, and he took something else with him also, namely, a pleasanter feeling and a more hopeful one than he had ever carried home with him down that avenue on any previous visit he had made at Dorincourt Castle. Chapter 9. But the Earl still refused to see the boy's mother. He was saddened when Cedric chose to hurry to his mother's house rather than see the pony that the Earl had just bought him. On the following Sunday morning, Mr. Mordaunt had a large congregation. Indeed, he could scarcely remember any Sunday on which the church had been so crowded. People appeared upon the scene who seldom did him the honor of coming to hear his sermons. In the course of the preceding week, many wonderful stories had been told of little Lord Fauntleroy. That's why there were so many people in the church that day. There were even people from Hazelton, which was the next parish. Suddenly one good woman uttered an exclamation. She said, "that must be the mother, pretty young thing." All who heard turned and looked at the slender figure in black coming up the path. The veil was thrown back from her face and they could see how fair and sweet it was, and how the bright hair curled as softly as a child's under the little widow's cap. She was not thinking of the people about, she was thinking of Cedric. But soon she could not help being attracted by the fact that she was being looked at and that her arrival had created some sort of sensation. She first noticed it because an old woman in a red cloak made a bobbing courtesy to her, and then another did the same thing and said, "God bless you, my lady." And one man after another took off his hat as she passed. For a moment she did not understand, and then she realized that it was because she was little Lord Fauntleroy's mother that they did so, and she flushed rather shyly and smiled and bowed too, and said, "Thank you," in a gentle voice to the old woman who had blessed her. She had scarcely passed through the stone porch into the church before the great event of the day happened. The carriage from the castle, with its handsome horses and tall liveried servants, bowled around the corner and down the green lane. "Here they come!" went from one looker-on to another. Every man, woman, and child looked curiously upon him. "He's the captain over again," said those of the onlookers who remembered his father. "He's the captain's self, to the life." "Just lean on me," they heard the boy said. "How glad the people are to see you, and how well they all seem to know you." "Take off your cap, Fauntleroy," said the Earl. "They are bowing to you." "To me!" cried Fauntleroy, whipping off his cap in a moment. When Fauntleroy was fairly seated, he made two discoveries which pleased him: the first that, across the church where he could look at her, his mother sat and smiled at him; the second, that at one end of the pew, against the wall, knelt two quaint figures carved in stone, facing each other as they kneeled on either side of a pillar supporting two stone missals, their pointed hands folded as if in prayer, their dress very antique and strange. On the tablet by them was written something of which he could only read the curious words: "Here lies the body of Gregory Arthur, 1st Earl of Dorincourt. Also of Alison Hildegard his wife." "May I whisper?" inquired his lordship, devoured by curiosity. "What is it?" said his grandfather. "Who are they?" "Some of your ancestors," answered the Earl, "who lived a few hundred years ago." He proceeded to find his place in the church service. When the music began, he stood up and looked across at his mother, smiling. He was very fond of music, and his mother and he often sang together, so he joined in with the rest, his pure, sweet, high voice rising as clear as the song of a bird. His mother, as she looked at him across the church, felt a thrill pass through her heart, and a prayer rose in it too, a prayer that the pure, simple happiness of his childish soul might last, and that the strange, great fortune which had fallen to him might bring no wrong or evil with it. "Oh," said he. She had said to him the evening before, as she hung over him and sang good night, before he went away. "Oh," said he, "dear, I wish for your sake I was very clever and could say a great many wise things. But only be good, dear, only be brave, only be kind and true always, and then you will never hurt anyone, so long as you live, and you may help many, and the big world may be better because my little child was born. And that is best of all," said he, "it is better than everything else, that the world should be a little better because a man has lived, even ever so little better, dearest." Fauntleroy had repeated her words to his grandfather. "And I thought about you when she said that," he ended, "and I told her that it was the way the world was because you had lived, and I was going to try if I could be like you." "And what did she say to that?" asked his lordship, a trifle uneasily. "She said that was right, and we must always look for good in people and try to be like it." As they came out of church, many of those who had attended the service stood waiting to see them pass. As they neared the gate, a man who stood with his hat in his hand made a step forward and then hesitated. He was a middle-aged farmer, with a careworn face. "Well, Higgins," said the Earl. Fauntleroy turned quickly to look at him. "Oh!" he exclaimed, "is it Mr. Higgins?" "Yes, my lord," said the man, his sunburned face reddening. "Mr. Newick told me his young lordship was kind enough to speak for me, and I thought I'd like to say a word of thanks, if I might be allowed." Perhaps he felt some wonder when he saw what a little fellow it was who had innocently done so much for him, and who stood there looking up just as one of his own less fortunate children might have done, apparently not realizing his own importance in the least. "Oh," said Fauntleroy, "I only wrote the letter. It was my grandfather who did it. But you know how he is about always being good to everybody." Higgins was on the verge of being panic-stricken. He felt it would be the safer and more discreet plan not to look at the Earl, as it had been well known that his fatherly affection for his sons had been such that he had seen them about twice a year, and that when they had been ill, he had promptly departed for London, because he would not be bored with doctors and nurses. "You see, Higgins," said the Earl with a fine grim smile, "you people have been mistaken in me. Lord Fauntleroy understands me. When you want reliable information on the subject of my character, apply to him. Get into the carriage, Fauntleroy." And Fauntleroy jumped in, and the carriage rolled away down the green lane, and even when it turned the corner into the high road, the Earl was still grimly smiling. Chapter 10. The morning the new pony had been tried, the Earl had been so pleased that he had almost forgotten his gout. When the groom had brought out the pretty creature, which arched its brown, glossy neck and tossed its fine head in the sun, the Earl had sat at the open window of the library and had looked on while Fauntleroy took his first riding lesson. Wilkins, the groom, led the animal by the bridle up and down before the library window. But sitting up straight and being led at a walk were not altogether and completely satisfactory. After a few minutes, Fauntleroy spoke to his grandfather, watching him from the window. "Can't I go by myself?" he asked, "and can't I go faster?" The boy on Fifth Avenue used to trot and canter. "Do you think you could trot and canter?" said the Earl. "I should like to try," answered Fauntleroy. His lordship made a sign to Wilkins, who at the signal brought up his own horse and mounted it and took Fauntleroy's pony by the leading rein. The next few minutes were rather exciting to the small equestrian. He found that trotting was not so easy as walking, and the faster the pony trotted, the less easy it was. "It jolts a good deal, doesn't it?" he said to Wilkins. "There," he panted, as they drew up, "I cantered. I didn't do it as well as the boy on Fifth Avenue, but I did it, and I stayed on." Since then scarcely a day passed in which the country people did not see them out together, cantering gaily on the high road or through the green lanes. Sometimes he would stop and talk with the children, and once Wilkins came back to the castle with the story of how Fauntleroy had insisted on dismounting near the village school, so that a boy who was lame and tired might ride home on his pony. And when we came to the cottage, and the boy's mother came out all in a taking to see what's up, he whipped off his cap and said, "I've brought your son home, madam," said he, "because his leg hurt him, and I don't think that stick is enough for him to lean on, and I'm going to ask my grandfather to have a pair of crutches made for him. And I'm blessed if the woman wasn't struck all of a heap, as well she might be," told Wilkins. When the Earl heard the story he was not angry, as Wilkins had been half afraid that he would be. On the contrary, he laughed outright, and called Fauntleroy up to him, and made him tell all about the matter from beginning to end, and then he laughed again. And actually, a few days later, the Dorincourt carriage stopped in the green lane before the cottage where the lame boy lived, and Fauntleroy jumped out and walked up to the door, carrying a pair of strong, light, new crutches shouldered like a gun, and presented them to Mrs. Hartle. The lame boy's name was Hartle, with these words, "My grandfather's compliments, and if you please, these are for your boy, and we hope he will get better." "I said your compliments," he explained to the Earl when he returned to the carriage. "You didn't tell me to, but I thought perhaps you forgot." That was right, wasn't it? And the Earl laughed again, and did not say it was not. In fact, the two were becoming more intimate every day, and every day Fauntleroy's faith in his lordship's benevolence and virtue increased. Apparently, he was to have everything he wanted, and to do everything he wished to do. And though this would certainly not have been a very wise plan to pursue with all small boys, his young lordship bore it amazingly well. Perhaps, notwithstanding his sweet nature, he might have been somewhat spoiled by it, if it had not been for the hours he spent with his mother at Court Lodge. There was one thing, it is true, which puzzled the little fellow very much. He thought over the mystery of it much oftener than anyone supposed. Even his mother did not know how often he pondered on it. The Earl for a long time never suspected that he did so at all. But, being quick to observe, the little boy could not help wondering why it was that his mother and grandfather never seemed to meet. He had noticed that they never did meet. About a week later, when Cedric was going one day to visit his mother, he found at the door, instead of the large carriage and prancing pair, a pretty little brougham and a handsome bay horse. "That is a present from you to your mother," the Earl said abruptly. "She cannot go walking about the country. She needs a carriage. The man who drives will take charge of it. It is a present from you." Fauntleroy's delight could but feebly express itself. He could scarcely contain himself until he reached the lodge. His mother was gathering roses in the garden. he flung himself out of the little brougham and flew to her. "Dearest," he cried, "could you believe it? This is yours. He says it is a present from me. It is your own carriage to drive everywhere in." He was so happy that she did not know what to say. She could not have borne to spoil his pleasure by refusing to accept the gift even though it came from the man who chose to consider himself her enemy. She was obliged to step into the carriage and let herself be taken to drive, while Fauntleroy told her stories of his grandfather's goodness and amiability. The very next day after that, Fauntleroy wrote to Mr. Hobbs. He wrote quite a long letter, and after the first copy was written, he brought it to his grandfather to be inspected. "Because," he said, "it's so uncertain about the spelling. And if you tell me the mistakes, I'll write it out again." "Do you miss your mother very much?" asked the Earl when he had finished reading this. "Yes," said Fauntleroy, "I miss her all the time." He went and stood before the Earl and put his hand on his knee, looking up at him. "You don't miss her, do you?" he said. "I don't know her," answered his lordship rather crustily. "I know that," said Fauntleroy, "and that's what makes me wonder. She told me not to ask you any questions, and I won't, but sometimes I can't help thinking, you know, and it makes me all puzzled." "I have no doubt," said his lordship dryly. And he drew down his beetling eyebrows and looked at the little boy so fixedly and so long that Fauntleroy wondered what he could be thinking of. Chapter 11. One fine morning, people were amazed to see little Lord Fauntleroy riding his pony with another companion than Wilkins. This new companion rode a tall, powerful grey horse, and was no other than the Earl himself. It was, in fact, Fauntleroy who had suggested this plan. Later the people became accustomed to the sight of the tall grey horse carrying the tall grey old man, with his handsome, fierce, eagle face, by the side of the brown pony which bore little Lord Fauntleroy. And in their rides together through the green lanes and pretty country roads, the two riders became more intimate than ever. And gradually the old man heard a great deal about Dearest and her life. One thing that the Earl discovered was that his son's wife did not lead an idle life. It was not long before he learned that the poor people knew her very well indeed. When there was sickness or sorrow or poverty in any house, the little brougham often stood before the door. "Do you know," said Fauntleroy once, "she says she feels so rich now that she wants to help the poor ones." It had not displeased the Earl to find that the mother of his heir had a beautiful young face and looked as much like a lady as if she had been a duchess. And yet he was often conscious of a hard, jealous pang when he saw how she filled her child's heart and how the boy clung to her as his best beloved. That same morning, he drew up his horse on an elevated point of the moor over which they rode, and made a gesture with his whip, over the broad, beautiful landscape spread before them. "Do you know that all that land belongs to me?" he said to Fauntleroy. "Does it?" answered Fauntleroy. "Do you know that someday, after my death, it will all belong to you, that and a great deal more?" "Then I don't want it," said Fauntleroy, "I want you to live always." "That's kind," answered the Earl in his dry way, "nevertheless, someday you will be the Earl of Dorincourt." Little Lord Fauntleroy sat very still in his saddle for a few moments. He looked over the broad moors, the green farms, the beautiful copses, the cottages in the lanes, the pretty village, and over the trees to where the turrets of the great castle rose, grey and stately. Then he gave a queer little sigh. "What are you thinking of?" asked the Earl. "I am thinking," replied Fauntleroy, "of what Dearest said to me." "What was it?" inquired the Earl. "She said that perhaps it was not so easy to be very rich, that if anyone had so many things always, one might sometimes forget that everyone else was not so fortunate, and that one who is rich should always be careful and try to remember." "I was talking to her about how good you were, and she said that was such a good thing, because an earl had so much power, and if he cared only about his own pleasure and never thought about the people who lived on his lands, they might have trouble that he could help. And I was just looking at all those houses, and thinking how I should have to find out about the people, when I was an earl." "How did you find out about them?" All his lordship's knowledge of his tenantry consisted in finding out which of them paid their rent promptly. "Newick finds out for me," he said, and he pulled his great grey moustache, and looked at his small questioner rather uneasily. "We will go home now," he added, "and when you are an earl, see to it that you are a better earl than I have been." He was very silent as they rode home. He felt it to be almost incredible that he who had never really loved anyone in his life, should find himself growing so fond of this little fellow, as without doubt he was. It was only about a week after that tried when, after a visit to his mother, Fauntleroy came into the library with a troubled, thoughtful face. The Earl watched him in silence, wondering what was coming. At last he looked up. "Does Newick know all about the people?" he asked. Contradictory as it may seem, there was nothing which entertained and edified him more than the little fellow's interest in his tenantry. "There is a place," said Fauntleroy, "Dearest has seen it. It is at the other end of the village. The houses are close together, and almost falling down, you can scarcely breathe, and the people are so poor, and everything is dreadful. Often they have fever, and the children die, and it makes them wicked to live like that, and be so poor and miserable. I told her you didn't know, and I would tell you, he said. You can make it all right, he said, just as you made it all right for Higgins. You always make it all right for everybody. I told her you would, and that Newick must have forgotten to tell you. The Earl looked down at the hand on his knee. He knew all about the tumble-down, miserable cottages, and the bad drainage, and the damp walls and broken windows and leaking roofs, and all about the poverty, the fever, and the misery. And yet, as he looked at the small hand on his knee, and from the small hand to the honest, earnest, frank-eyed face, he was actually a little ashamed both of Earl's Court and himself. What? He said, you want to make a builder of model cottages of me, do you? And he positively put his own hand upon the childish one and stroked it. Those must be pulled down, said Fauntleroy, with great eagerness. Dearest says so. Let us go and have them pulled down tomorrow. The people will be so glad when they see you. They'll know you have come to help them. And his eyes shone like stars in his glowing face. The Earl rose from his chair and put his hand on the child's shoulder. Let us go out and take our walk on the terrace, he said, with a short laugh, and we can talk it over. Chapter 12. Fauntleroy soon knew that his grandfather loved him and always liked him to be near to his chair if they were in the library, opposite to him at table, or by his side when he rode or drove or took his evening walk on the broad terrace. Do you remember, Cedric said once, looking up from his book as he lay on the rug, do you remember what I said to you that first night about our being good companions? I don't think any people could be better companions than we are, do you? We are pretty good companions, I should say, replied his lordship. Come here. Fauntleroy scrambled up and went to him. Is there anything you want, the Earl asked, anything you have not? The little fellow's brown eyes fixed themselves on his grandfather with a rather wistful look. Only one thing, he answered. It is dearest. The old eyes and the young ones looked into each other through a moment of silence. Then the Earl knitted his brows. Do you never forget about your mother? He said. No, answered Fauntleroy, never, and she never forgets about me. I shouldn't forget about you, you know, if I didn't live with you. Upon my word, said the Earl, after looking at him a moment longer, I believe you would. The jealous pang that came when the boy spoke so of his mother seemed even stronger than it had been before. It was stronger because of this old man's increasing affection for the boy. Cedric and his mother were loved by everyone in the village, and it came as a terrible shock when news of another heir arrived. The Earl's oldest son, dead by that time, had been briefly married to an American woman. She had a child, and that boy was the Earl's true heir. Cedric, however, was not too upset at the news. He was relieved to hear that he would still be able to live with his grandfather, and that his mother would be able to stay in her little house. The boy's kindness and lack of greed only strengthened the Earl's resolve to make Cedric his heir. Finally, the old man decided to visit the boy's mother, and after that meeting they became friends. Cedric often wrote to his old friends in New York, and they were alarmed to hear that he was no longer heir to Dorincourt. The story was in the newspapers, too, and Dick had a shock when he saw a picture of the woman who claims that her son was the true heir. He recognized her as Minna, the woman had married his brother Tom. She had been violent and aggressive, and had left Tom years ago, angry that he hadn't made enough money. Chapter 13. It is astonishing how short a time it takes for very wonderful things to happen. It had taken only a few minutes, apparently, to change all the fortunes of the little boy dangling his red legs from the high stool in Mr. Hobbs's store, and to transform him from a small boy, living the simplest life in a quiet street, into an English nobleman, the heir to an earldom and magnificent wealth. It had taken only a few minutes, apparently, to change him from an English nobleman into a penniless little impostor. And, surprising as it may appear, it did not take nearly so long a time to alter the face of everything again and to give back to him all that he had been in danger of losing. After all, the woman who had called herself Lady Fauntleroy was not nearly so clever as she was wicked, and when she had been closely pressed by Mr. Havisham's questions about her marriage and her boy, she had made one or two blunders which had caused suspicion to be awakened, and then she had lost her presence of mind and her temper, and in her excitement and anger has betrayed herself still further. All the mistakes she made were about her child. Mr. Havisham found out that her story of the boy's being born in a certain part of London was false, and just then there came the letter from the lawyer in New York, and Mr. Hobbs's letters also. What an evening it was when those letters arrived, and when Mr. Havisham and the Earl sat and talked their plans over in the library. "After my first 3 meetings with her," said Mr. Havisham, "I began to suspect her strongly. It appeared to me that the child was older than she said he was, and she made a slip in speaking of the date of his birth and then tried to patch the matter up. The story these letters bring fits in with several of my suspicions. Our best plan will be to cable at once for these 2 Tiptons, say nothing about them to her, and suddenly confront her with them when she is not expecting it. My opinion is that she will be frightened out of her wits, and will betray herself on the spot." And that was what actually happened. Mr. Havisham kept her from suspecting anything by continuing to have interviews with her, in which he assured her he was investigating her statements, and she really began to feel so secure that her spirits rose immensely and she began to be as insolent as might have been expected. But one fine morning, as she sat in her sitting room at the inn called the Dorincourt Arms, making some very fine plans for herself, Mr. Havisham was announced, and when he entered, he was followed by no less than 3 persons. One was a sharp-faced boy and one was a big young man and the third was the Earl of Dorincourt. She sprang to her feet and actually uttered a cry of terror. She had never expected to see them again. It must be confessed that Dick grinned a little when he saw her. "Hello, Minna," he said. The big young man, who was Ben, stood still a minute and looked at her. "Do you know her?" Mr. Havisham asked, glancing from one to the other. "Yes," said Ben. "I know her and she knows me." The woman, seeing herself so baffled and exposed, lost all control over herself and flew into such a rage as Ben and Dick had often seen her in before. "I can swear to her in any court," Ben said to Mr. Havisham, "and I can bring a dozen others who will." Then he clenched his hands suddenly and turned on her. "Where's the child?" he demanded. "He's going with me." "He is done with you, and so am I." And just as he finished saying the words, the door leading into the bedroom opened a little, and the boy, probably attracted by the sound of the loud voices, looked in. He was not a handsome boy, but he had rather a nice face, and he was quite like Ben, his father, as anyone could see, and there was the 3-cornered scar on his chin. Ben walked up to him and took his hand, and his own was trembling. "Yes," he said, "I could swear to him, too." "Tom," he said to the little fellow, "I'm your father, I've come to take you away." It evidently rather pleased the boy to hear that he was going away. He had been so accustomed to queer experiences that it did not surprise him to be told by a stranger that he was his father. He objected so much to the woman who had come a few months before to the place where he had lived since his babyhood, and who had suddenly announced that she was his mother, that he was quite ready for a change. Ben walked out of the room, holding the child's hand and not looking at the woman once. She was fairly raving with fury. "Come, come, my young woman," said Mr. Havisham. "This won't do at all. If you don't want to be locked up, you really must behave yourself." And there was something so very businesslike in his tones that, probably feeling that the safest thing she could do would be to get out of the way. "We shall have no more trouble with her," said Mr. Havisham. And he was right, for that very night she left the Dorincourt Arms and took the train to London, and was seen no more. When the Earl left the room after the interview, he went at once to his carriage. "To Court Lodge," he said to Thomas. When the carriage stopped at Court Lodge, Cedric was in the drawing room with his mother. The Earl came in without being announced. He looked an inch or so taller, and a great many years younger. His deep eyes flashed. "Where," he said, "is Lord Fauntleroy?" Mrs. Errol came forward, a flush rising to her cheek. "Is it Lord Fauntleroy?" she asked. "Is it, indeed?" The Earl put out his hand and grasped hers. "Yes," he answered, "it is." Then he put his other hand on Cedric's shoulder. "Fauntleroy," he said in his unceremonious, authoritative way, "ask your mother when she will come to us at the castle." Fauntleroy flung his arms around his mother's neck. "To live with us!" he cried. "To live with us always!" The Earl looked at Mrs. Errol, and Mrs. Errol looked at the Earl. His lordship was entirely in earnest. He had made up his mind to waste no time in arranging this matter. He had begun to think it would suit him to make friends with his heir's mother. "Are you quite sure you want me?" said Mrs. Errol, with her soft, pretty smile. "Quite sure," he said bluntly. "We have always wanted you, but we were not exactly aware of it. We hope you will come." Chapter 14. Ben took his boy and went back to his cattle ranch in California, and he returned under very comfortable circumstances. Just before his going, Mr. Havisham had an interview with him in which the lawyer told him that the Earl of Dorincourt wished to do something for the boy who might have turned out to be Lord Fauntleroy, and so he had decided that it would be a good plan to invest in a cattle ranch of his own, and put Ben in charge of it on terms which would make it pay him very well, and which would lay a foundation for his son's future. And so when Ben went away, he went as the prospective master of a ranch. And Tom, the boy, grew up on it into a fine young man and was devotedly fond of his father. But Dick and Mr. Hobbs, who had actually come over with the others to see that things were properly looked after, did not return for some time. It had been decided at the outset that the Earl would provide for Dick, and would see that he received a solid education, and Mr. Hobbs had decided that as he himself had left a reliable substitute in charge of his store, he could afford to wait to see the festivities which were to celebrate Lord Fauntleroy's 8th birthday. All the tenantry were invited, and there were to be feasting and dancing and games in the park, and bonfires and fireworks in the evening. "Just like the 4th of July," said Lord Fauntleroy. It must be owned that Mr. Hobbs had been rather overwhelmed by the splendors Fauntleroy felt it his duty to show him. The entrance gate and the stone lions and the avenue impressed Mr. Hobbs somewhat at the beginning, and when he saw the castle, and the flower gardens, and the hothouses, and the terraces, and the peacocks, and the dungeon, and the armor, and the great staircase, and the stables, and the liveried servants, he really was quite bewildered. But it was the picture gallery which seemed to be the finishing stroke. Something in the manner of a museum, he said to Fauntleroy, when he was led into the great, beautiful room. "No," said Fauntleroy, rather doubtfully. "I don't think it's a museum. My grandfather says these are my ancestors." "Your ancestors!" ejaculated Mr. Hobbs. "All of them?" "Your great-uncle, he must have had a family." "Did he raise them all?" And he sank into a seat and looked around him with quite an agitated countenance. Privately he was not nearly so much disgusted with earls and their mode of life as he had expected to be, and it is to be doubted whether his strictly republican principles were not shaken a little by a closer acquaintance with castles and ancestors. What a grand day it was when little Lord Fauntleroy's birthday arrived, and how his young lordship enjoyed it! How beautiful the park looked, filled with the thronging people dressed in their gayest and best, and with the flags flying from the tents in the top of the castle. Nobody had stayed away who could possibly come, because everybody was really glad that little Lord Fauntleroy was to be little Lord Fauntleroy. And positively everyone liked the Earl rather better, and felt more amiably toward him. What scores and scores of people there were under the trees, and in the tents, and on the lawns! At the castle, there were ladies and gentlemen who had come to see the fun, and to congratulate the Earl, and to meet Mrs. Errol. Lady Lauredale and Sir Harry were there, and Sir Thomas and his daughters, and Mr. Havisham. And the sun shone and the flags fluttered and the games were played and the dances danced. And as the gaieties went on and the joyous afternoon passed, his little lordship was simply radiantly happy. The whole world seemed beautiful to him. There was someone else who was happy, too, an old man, who, though he had been rich and noble all his life, had not often been very honestly happy. Perhaps, indeed, I shall tell you that I think it was because he was rather better than he had been that he was rather happier. And every day he had been more pleased with his son's wife. It was true, as the people said, that he was beginning to like her too. He liked to hear her sweet voice and to see her sweet face, and as he sat in his armchair, he used to watch her and listen as she talked to her boy, and he heard loving, gentle words which were new to him, and he began to see why the little fellow who had lived in a New York side street and known grocery men and made friends with boot blacks, was still so well bred and manly a little fellow that he made no one ashamed of him, even when fortune changed him into the heir to an English earldom, living in an English castle. As the old Earl of Dorincourt looked at him that day, moving about the park among the people, talking to those he knew and making his ready little bow when anyone greeted him, entertaining his friends Dick and Mr. Hobbs, or standing near his mother listening to her, little Lord Fauntleroy was delighted. He stood and smiled, and made bows, and flushed rosy red with pleasure up to the roots of his bright hair. "Is it because they like me, dearest?" he said to his mother. "Is it, dearest? I'm so glad." And then the Earl put his hand on the child's shoulder and said to him, "Fauntleroy, say to your guests that you thank them for their kindness." Fauntleroy gave a glance up at him and then at his mother. So, he made a little step forward, and everybody looked at him. Such a beautiful, innocent little fellow he was, too, with his brave, trustful face, and he spoke as loudly as he could, his childish voice ringing out quite clear and strong. "I'm ever so much obliged to you," he said, "and I hope you'll enjoy my birthday, because I've enjoyed it so much, and I'm very glad I'm going to be an Earl. I didn't think at first I should like it, but now I do, and I love this place so, and I think it is beautiful, and when I am an Earl, I am going to try to be as good as my grandfather." And amid the shouts and clamor of applause, he stepped back with a little sigh of relief, and put his hand into the Earl's and stood close to him, smiling and leaning against his side. And that would be the very end of my story, but I must add one curious piece of information, which is that Mr. Hobbs became so fascinated with high life and was so reluctant to leave his young friend that he actually sold his corner store in New York, and settled in the English village of Earlsborough, where he opened a shop which was patronized by the castle and consequently was a great success. And about 10 years after, when Dick, who had finished his education and was going to visit his brother in California, asked the good grocer if he did not wish to return to America, he shook his head seriously. "Not to live there," he said. "Not to live there, I want to be near him, and sort of look after him. It's a good enough country for them that's young and stirring, but there's faults in it. There's not an ancestor among them, nor an earl,